Well, welcome to the podcast, Anna.
Hello, Jack.
So, just remind me, what do you do at the University of Nottingham? What's your role?
So I'm an associate professor in archaeology and I specialise in bones. So I
Okay,
study the remains of humans and other animals, any time period really. I've worked on material from 2 million years ago right up until, present day really.
and it's fair to say that bears are of interest to you, isn't it?
Bears, yes, yes, I've been doing quite a lot of work on bears. It turned out that they'd been somewhat neglected. And as I worked on carnivores, I worked on caves and cave archaeology, and I'd also done some work on zoos. Bears turned out to be the perfect animal to study because they're carnivores, they sleep in caves, and they turn up in zoos.
So, like many people, I think a lot of people will realise that we did have bears in the UK, but they probably don't know much more than that. So, when did we last have bears roaming freely in Britain?
You started with a very good question there. We don't actually know. Um, So there's two ideas which I've put forward. We haven't confirmed either of them yet. One is that they become extinct sort of in the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. So we're looking sort of 4,500 years ago.
Oh wow,
Um,
that long ago.
yes, yeah. So once people start farming, clearing the field, clearing forest to make fields, etc., it becomes harder for a large carnivore to find space to live in. Um, or alternatively, there is one bone from the Yorkshire Dales which dates to the early medieval period, about 600 AD, so just after the Romans. And so one possibility is that that could be an outlier, a last bear. But one another possibility is that it could have been put there by people and isn't actually a wild animal at all.
Right. So quite
So
a big difference in timescale then, isn't it? Like four, or what's that? Over 4,000 years between them.
well, there's two. Yeah, so it's about what the yeah. So the Bronze Age would be about 4,500 years ago up, and it would be about 1,500 years ago for the yes, it's
Oh
a
right.
3,000
Okay.
year gap.
Okay. Is there any indication of how numerous bears would have been? I mean, I guess if they were really numerous, we'd be finding bones all the time, wouldn't we? But
Yeah, I mean we don't have much information on them. One of the things about bears is we tend to find their remains in caves, probably because they were denning in caves to hibernate, and then they some of them don't survive the winter, and so we find their bones in there. I mean that's good because they're well preserved, and often caves are in places where sometimes the soils aren't very good for preserving bones. So we've got this sort of snapshot of bears in various places around the country that have caves. And then the question is, to what extent are they representative of other animals that might not have been in areas that have caves? And we really don't know.
right. And what species would they have been?
For Britain, in the last sort of 10, 20,000 years, we're looking at brown bears.
Are they the same as grizzly, or are they separate?
They are the
They
same
are.
species as the grizzly,
Okay.
but it's got different names where depending on where you go in the world. But yes, it's
Right.
all the brown bear, Ursus arctos. We do have evidence of polar bears in Britain, but they're
Really?
much earlier. They're much earlier back in the last ice age,
Okay.
and then people import them as not for the novelty value
Right.
um,
Yeah.
a bit later. But yes, so brown bears is largely what we're looking at archaeologically.
And I guess if you go far enough back, we would have had cave bears, would we?
There's a little bit of evidence for cave bears, yeah,
Yeah, they're
not
the
a lot though.
no, but they're much bigger, aren't they? They're the really big bears, aren't they? Is that right? Or not really?
They're a bit bigger than the brown bear. I think Arctodus was the massive bear. That was the really
Oh,
hypercarnivorous one from Alaska.
oh, am I getting mixed up? Okay, okay.
The cave bear is probably just a large herbivore, a large vegetarian bear.
Oh, is that right? Oh,
Yeah,
okay, okay. I suppose its
but we've
size
got
doesn't.
nothing. Sorry.
No, sorry, no. So size doesn't necessarily mean it's a big mean carnivore, does it? So no. Okay.
No, no, and we've got nothing in Britain like the big sites that you have in Europe, where you've got thousands, tens of thousands of cave bear bones. We've got nothing like that here.
No, and I guess you've kind of already answered this then. But so when did bears die out? It's between the two. You reckon it's either 4,000 or or medieval age is when you reckon that the last kind of possible native bears went
Yes,
extinct.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I'd put my money on the earlier period, but we're doing some radiocarbon dating at the moment, so that might. We're working on the material. So what's happened is there's been dated material comes from archaeological sites because if you find a pot next to a bare bone, you can infer that it's similar date to the pot. But all of the material from the cave sites, we didn't know what age the wild bears were. So we've been radiocarbon dating the wild bears, and hopefully soon we'll have some idea of what the patterns of wild bears in Britain look like.
And so presumably then you are finding bear remains in these archaeological sites every now and again. So you mentioned not common, but they are turning up.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, every now and again a site will turn up a bare bone, but no, they're not at all common. Looking at, I think I've got a list of about 80 sites across Britain for the last sort of 11,000 years or so.
Oh,
So
okay.
really pretty rare.
Yeah. And is it always that? I mean, I guess would it be that they're there because the bear died, or is there some significance to people bringing those bones in, like so maybe spiritual or you said ornamental or things like that? Is that one of the main reasons?
I think we're probably looking at a lot of different reasons. In
Right.
some cases, there may well be a sort of spiritual, as you say, or ritual aspect to having some bear remains at the site. In other cases, we're looking at claws in particular. We find the terminal phalange, the one that has got our fingernails on for humans. We find quite a lot of those in cremations. So there's a couple of Iron Age cremations which have these claws, and then in the early medieval period we get cremated claws again, and that's probably people being wrapped in bear skins and then cremated.
And I guess I mean I suppose there's no way of us knowing why they did that, but presumably some sort of pagan religion, is it, or something like that, or we'll never know, I guess, will we?
No, I mean there's work from Scandinavia where it's more common. They're still not really common, but bear claws do turn up in graves and cremations again over there. And it may not be that it may be in some cases the bear is important, but in other cases it's probably that the bear is just an exotic imported item. So for Britain, sorry, it is probably particularly in the Iron Age, I think, an imported exotic thing. No, it doesn't necessarily matter that it's a bear, but you've
No.
got it from somewhere else, and
Right.
that means you've got money and you've got connections.
So like a status thing then.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas from Scandinavia, where the bear is local, or at least you don't have to sail for days in order to get hold of your bear skin. They seem to be a bit more common.
Okay, that makes more sense. And obviously, if we look at um, wider European folklore, like Scandinavian or in Germany, Brothers Grimm and things like that, bears feature quite a lot. But I was trying to think if bears feature in any British folklore or literature, and I couldn't really think of any. But I don't know if any spring to mind for you.
No, and that's part of my feeling as to why bears are extinct quite early.
Yeah.
Because I have a feeling that if they were still wandering around, it would have been incorporated into the stories that we have, and they're not. And also, if you look at place name evidence, there's multiple place names for other extinct animals from Britain, like the beaver or the wolf.
Yeah.
Bear place names are very, very rare. And when they do turn up, they can often be tied back to someone with a tame bear living there rather than it being, the place where the bears are.
I seem to remember I watched your online talk before we did this, and you mentioned there's a pub somewhere, isn't there? Is it I can't remember the name of the pub, but it's because of bear baiting, where it got the name. Is that right? Or there was a pub named because of something to do with bears.
Oh, there's one in yes, in Nottingham. Yes, the Dog and
Yeah,
Bear pub.
that's it. So that was presumably because of bear baiting, is it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So Nottingham was known for bear baiting, but then most city or towns were. Bear baiting happened everywhere. The town council would pay for the bear ward to bring the bears to be baited. And in Nottingham, you've got the Dog and Bear pub, or the former Dog and Bear pub, because it's not the Dog and Bear anymore. But above the doors, or no, sorry, above the windows of the building, there is a dog on one side and a bear on the other. So it is, even in the architecture, it's linking the dogs and the bears together.
So for those that don't know, what is bear baiting and how popular was it?
So bear baiting is a sport, I say in inverted commas, of getting dogs to attack a bear And we think people would bet on the outcome, but we don't know, because there's very little sort of archival work being done in this area. You needed a license to own a bear, which you got from the king or the king's representatives. So it was quite a high status thing to have a bear ward. Whether it was a high status thing to be a bear ward, I'm not quite so sure, because you're the person taking the bear around the country. But you would arrive in a village or a town, you would be paid by the town council to bait your bear. And probably there is betting going on in the background, which is really where you make your money, but we don't know about that bit. And it's very popular.
Yeah, and that, I guess, is a more extreme version of like badger baiting, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of, it is the ancestor, I suppose, of badger baiting. And I mean, you had bull baiting, you had bear baiting. So those were the two sort of really big common ones that would happen in marketplaces all over the place. But you also had a number of other blood sports, things that you'd never think about nowadays. I mean, cockfighting, a lot of people have heard of, but throwing at cocks, where basically you'd tie a cockerel to a stick or bury it in the ground and then throw rocks at it. You don't hear about that as a sport anymore, but that was quite popular as well. It's quite odd what people got up to in the past when it comes to animals.
Yeah. No, you're
what
right.
I really love, what I really love that I've never really read much about or heard much about, is the fact that Stamford and various places around Lincolnshire used to have bull running. So like the Pamplona bull run.
All right.
Would set a bull running through the town, and people would go out, and that was the big festival once a year.
Wow, I did not know that would happen around there. I was going to say, I wonder why it doesn't go on, but there's an obvious reason why it doesn't go on now, isn't there? So I don't know. It's crazy.
It's so certainly the narrative we have now of Britain, the nation of our animal lovers, step back a couple of hundred years, and it was a different society, and they were doing different things.
Yeah, I bet. And so when did bear baiting kind of go out of favour then?
Now, that's a good question. What we know is that it's made illegal in 1835. So there's a law passed which makes bull baiting and bear baiting and cockfighting illegal then. And what we don't know yet is about how it declines. So it was very, very popular during the Tudors. So Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and then into the Stuarts with James I, all loved animal baiting. It was the thing. There were arenas built in London on the south bank of the Thames where you could go and watch it. It was very formalised in London. And then when Charles II came back after the Restoration, he asked for a bear baiting arena to be built because the Puritans had had them all demolished. And so that was one of the first acts he did, was to have the bear baiting arena built. But then that closes down in the 1680s and another one isn't built. So that suggests the beginning of a decline.
Right. Because I guess
what happens...
Go on, you're right, Hannah.
What happens between then and 1835, we don't really know at the moment.
No. Because I guess, like, say, cockfighting, for example, everyone's going to have chickens. They're small animals. They're probably quite easy to do an underground cockfight. But a bear, if that's illegal, where are you going to get an illegal bear from, and where are you going to hide it to do this sort of thing? So I can understand why that maybe didn't continue as much as that. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's harder to hide your bear, although there are a couple of, well, there's one drawing in London in the British Museum of an indoor bear baiting arena. So I mean,
an illegal one.
If you had pardon?
An illegal one.
No, this was prior to it.
This was prior. Okay.
But if you could do it indoors, and if you were set up to do it indoors, then you might get away with it for a bit longer.
Yeah. Oh wow, that's amazing, isn't it? Well, it's not amazing; it's terrible, but it's just interesting what kind of made these people decide to do it. And one of the things that we had bears for was bear grease. So again, like what's bear grease?
So bear's grease is literally what it says. It is the fat of a bear. And you can do two things to it. You can use it as it is, render it down so it becomes a bit like, well, I suppose lard. It's basically lard, but bear lard. Or particularly in North America, they had bear oil, which was literally an oil that you would use to cook with. But in Britain, bear's grease, which was bear lard, which you would use to put on your hair. And particularly if you were a gentleman who was beginning to lose their hair, it was supposed to make it thicker and grow better. And that goes back to Pliny with the ancient Greeks. And he said that that's what it was useful for. And that just carried on for several thousand years of people using it.
Presumably, there's no evidence to suggest that it does.
Not that I know of.
No. Okay, then the bears are safe for now. Then, and what prompted you to study these bears? Then why pick those? I mean, you mentioned at the beginning there wasn't a lot done on them prior. So was it that kind of attracted to you, or have you always been interested in bears?
Yeah, well, as I said, I worked on carnivores, and they are they're an obvious carnivore to study, and yes, I was finding their remains in cave sites, and you get them in zoos. It just seemed to be something that sort of came together in all of my interests, sort of coalesced in one large furry animal that it turned out hadn't really been studied in Britain, not really, and since about 1906.
Oh, quite a while then.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
so,
go on, sorry, Hannah.
Oh, I was just going to say there were a couple of books I should mention. Derek Yalden did an excellent book in 1999, I think it was, called The History of British Mammals, where he pulled together a big table of all of the finds of bears. And then Andy Hammond had a chapter in a book called Extinction and Invasions, edited by Terry O'Connor and Naomi Sykes, where he also pulled together more recent bears. So I was building on that work, but in terms of someone going back and actually looking at the remains of the bears themselves at each site and seeing the bones, nobody had done it since 1906.
Yeah, it's mad to think how long a gap there is between now, isn't there?
Yeah, I think partly it's because they're very rare, so it's very hard to make a big project out of them. And also, they're not really, and we'll probably talk about rewilding, but they're not the obvious candidate to put back in the landscape compared to some of the
other creatures. Yeah, and you've led me nicely, because that's going to be my my next and final question. So obviously rewilding is something we've covered on the podcast a few times, and it seems to be the currency of the day at the moment, with people trying to bring back all kinds of creatures. And bears, sometimes they get lumped in bears and wolves, and sometimes on their own to a degree. But I just wondered, what were your thoughts on the reintroduction of bears in the UK? Is it practical in your eyes, or is it more of a pipe dream?
Yeah, I mean, it would be lovely, wouldn't it? I mean, who wouldn't like to go to the Peak District and see a family of bears wandering across the landscape? I mean, I would. It would be brilliant, but I don't think it's practical. I think we're too small a landmass. We have too many people. I think it could only be a sort of an enclosed sort of tourist environment. They wouldn't be free living bears, and I'm not sure why we would be suggesting them. They're not like beavers, able to actually change the landscape for the better. They're not like perhaps wolves, which can move on the deer and keep them shifting. I mean, they will certainly eat deer if they get their claws on them. Moose is a big part of their diet, or moose calves are a big part of their diet in Scandinavia, but I don't see them having that core role that needs to be replicated, and I think they're just a bit too big.
I think it would probably concern a lot of people, isn't it? I mean, I guess because we've lived so long without large predators, it's always, for me, if you go to a country where there are large predators, it can be a bit nerve-wracking. But then obviously there are people who live with these things every single day, and they just know to be wary and whatever. I just think you'd maybe have a hard time convincing the British public to release a very large, potentially dangerous animal into the wild, free roaming. But like you say, I do like the idea of heading up to the Peak District and seeing a family of bears. But I don't know, maybe one day, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about the woodland. I don't think I've ever been so conscious of being in a wood as when I was in Romania with a ham sandwich in my rucksack and I'd just seen some bears. But yeah, yes, it makes the environment a very, very different place. And I think that's interesting when we think about the past, because because we're not used to putting those sorts of animals in the woodland. When we're thinking about the Neolithic or the Mesolithic, we're not thinking about it being such a very different place, with wild boars and lynx and bears and really a very, very different environment that you wouldn't just pop in for a Sunday stroll. You'd have to think about going in.
Yeah, definitely. I was in Hungary 2 or 3 years ago on the Hungary-Slovenian border, and I went out in the morning to go see if I could find some fire salamanders. I thought I'll go see if I can. So I was just in the woodland looking under logs and things, and I was out there all morning. And I came back for breakfast, and the guys went, "Oh, did you see the bear this morning?" And I went, "What bear? I didn't know there were bears here." And I went, "Oh yeah, it was seen just a couple miles down the road." And I was thinking, "Oh bloody hell!" This thing. I think I would have been in equal measure in awe and a healthy respect if I'd seen it. I don't think I'd have panicked too much, but had I known there was a bear, I probably wouldn't have gone out on my own. But one of those things, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, and I think it is interesting to think of the landscape as not this. I mean, really, for us, a Sunday stroll, go out and get some exercise. Let's see the sun, and but being much more dynamic and being much more. You need to think about it.
Definitely. Well, it's been fascinating to talk to you about bears. I mean, again, it's a subject I never really knew it was. Potentially as late as the medieval period. I'd like to think they were hanging around that long, but obviously people don't realise that we did have bears in the UK at one point. So thanks for coming on to the podcast.
You're very welcome.